ground rules. He has about, I don't know, 45 minutes to an hour to present his work. So we'll let him present his work first, and then if you have questions, please jot it down. After he's done, then the committee will have the first kind of dibs at questions, and then afterwards, we'll open it to the audience. So take it away, Brian.
Okay, is microphone good? I don't know, we didn't check before, but you can all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, my name is Brian. I'm excited you're here today. A friend once told me that if you're not nervous before you public speak, you don't care. So let me just tell you, I care a lot right now because I'm very nervous. So before we get started, I just want to say thank you. If you read the dissertation, which you haven't because you haven't seen it, the thank you page hits all these people. But I have my wife in the back, I have my mother, and I also have my wife's parents here. And of course, I want to say thank you to my committee. So Praveen, Max, and Addie, thank you so much. And there's a couple other DBA faculty that helped get me to this point, so thank you for that. So again, my name's Brian, and the topic of my dissertation is Antecedents to Taxpayer Compliance, Essays Exploring the Influence of Personality and Culture. So the plan for today, I'm going to give you kind of a quick introduction, background, motivation as to where this study came from. And then it's broken down into two essays. So we're going to spend time first on essay 1, then we're going to move into essay 2. Hopefully, there are some new faces in the room. Hopefully, you had a chance to look at the proposal defense that I did back in December. We won't spend a lot of time on literature review or hypothesis development because I really want to get into the results and implications of what I found. Once we finish going through that, I'll do a quick summary, and then as Praveen said, we'll open it up for any questions or comments. Okay? So, before I got into teaching, so I've been teaching around the last 4 years, but prior to that, I spent around 16 years in public accounting working on specifically taxes and small businesses. So when I served as a tax professional, clients would come in and I would be talking with them, and in the back of my head, I always had this question, are they being honest with me? Are they telling me the truth? Okay, now some areas of tax compliance are pretty easy to prove that because we have to ask for work papers to support what clients would tell us. But sometimes it's what they're not telling me, that they're not giving me a work paper for, that also brought in some questions. So as I started in the DBA program, one of the things we use both in professional and academic use is what we call a tax gap. So the tax gap is the difference between what taxpayers owe and what they pay on a voluntary and timely basis. So the most recently reported number is this is $458 billion per year that's not being complied with. Okay, so if we break that number down, $319 billion relate to those individual taxpayers. If we break that down even further, we end up with $264 billion related to people that are underreporting income. So that's really the background. As I took my professional experience and I found out the size of this tax gap, I wanted to know more. So as I started reading through literature, there were a couple areas that these essays kind of fill holes for that I didn't see addressed in current literature and really kind of helped get me excited about pushing the DBA program in my dissertation forward. So the two questions that I seek to answer, the first one looks at personality traits and how those relate to individual taxpayer compliance. And then my second essay looks at national culture and specifically the moderating influence that national culture would have on individual taxpayer compliance intentions. All right, so the first essay, this is the one that focuses on personality. So just some background as far as some of the literature. So I've tried to step this together so it makes sense, and we're going to cover it rather quickly because I do want to get into the results. So a lot of research has looked at demographic predictors, so age, sex, gender, income source, other things such as risk of penalty, fear of sanctions, those types of things. So I've cited two literature reviews at the top there. Do a pretty good job pulling together a bunch of articles that showed relationships in that area. As time has gone on in tax compliance, one of the questions that we ask is, why do so many taxpayers actually choose to comply? Okay, now that tax gap is huge, so there was a little bit of a shift where it wasn't so much is the penalty causing people not to comply, but morale or your belief in the tax system and the fairness of tax and things like that, how does that encourage compliance? From there, other pieces of literature, such as Alm et al., go into ethical influences. And rather logical, The higher your ethical standards, the more likely you are to comply. And then even some more recent literature on top of that has looked at social norms, which social norms would basically be, my beliefs cause me to do something, the beliefs of those around me influence my beliefs, and therefore in turn cause me to do something. So as I kept going into the literature, this stuff was all very interesting, and then I came across personality, okay? Specifically these big 5 personality traits. So we have extraversion, neuroticism, openness to experience, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. And as I got into this, there were some gaps in the literature. And personality is this predisposition to behave systematically. So if you've ever filed a tax return, it's a system. It's gather documents, decide what to put in the tax return, and then pay what you're supposed to pay, or hopefully get a refund. So very systematic. And as I continued in this personality and the relationship with tax compliance, the closest paper I could find that looked at these big 5 personality traits and compliance looked at white-collar crime. In my experience as a professional, some of the findings in that paper, I said, I just don't know if this is going to hold true when we only look at tax compliance. So the aim of this study is really going after 3 pieces, if you will, and I just want to highlight these because the results are going to bring them back. So the first one is, what is the relationship of personality? Okay? The second thing is tax compliance, is it fair to keep that under the umbrella of white-collar crime when we look at personality, or do we need to really pull it out? Are there some differences? And then the third piece, and this is a little bit of a prelude to what's coming, a lot of tax compliance research to date measures that dependent variable with a single item question. How much mileage would you take on a tax return? Things like that. So in my pursuit of finding more, that is one thing that I'm going to talk about. I won't go too far because we're going to talk about that. But here's my research model. On the left-hand side, we have the 5 personality traits. On our right side, we have the dependent variable, tax compliance intentions. And then we're controlling for a variety of things just to really make sure we're getting as much influence of personality. So I'm not going to take the time to go through all this. I'm not going to state these specifically on hypothesis form. More a slide if we need to reference back to it for questions. But I want to talk through extraversion. So in this big 5 trait, there are lower scores and higher scores for individuals. So for the personality trait of extraversion, a lower score would typically be someone that's reserved, even-paced, and independent, while a higher scoring individual would be more assertive, active, sociable, and talkative. So the big 5 traits are somewhat logical if we read through this. We're not going to time, but again, low score, high score, and we're looking at these 5 personality traits. So this brings us to the hypotheses. And what I've done here to try and color code, the red is where we're going with non-compliance. So the literature brought us to these hypotheses as to a positive relationship. And the relationship that I've shown up there, just because I think it gets people more excited, is what relationship causes people not to comply. Bad stuff is somewhat exciting, so our hypotheses are all stated in a direction as to non-compliance. So again, pulling off that trait of extraversion, positive relationship in that extroverts would be more likely not to comply. All right, so methods as to how this first essay came together. So this first essay is original source data that I went out to Amazon MTurk for. And I presented a story of 6 different tax scenarios to a taxpayer to make. So if you remember where I gave you that little introduction, a lot of tax compliance research looks at 1, maybe 2 questions as to tax compliance. I sought after going after 6 unique situations. And when I say unique, these are 6 situations that could apply to any taxpayer, regardless of income, as long as they were in that specific situation, as well as a combined tax score. And in addition, as that control variable box showed before, we control for quite a bit as to frequency of exposure, social desirability, fairness of the system, and so forth. The story presented to the respondents, so again, this was administered through MTurk, and they were given a situation where they were asked to assume the role of Jesse. Jesse took a new job, he moved to a new location, he enrolled in college, he was lucky in his gambling winnings and stuff like that. So each of the pieces of those stories fed into one of the 6 measures that we were looking to measure. I've listed them up here. So again, 6 in total. And so we have 2 related to income, so Jesse's income and his gambling winnings. We also have 2 as to expenses. 1 as to the expenses related to his graphic design work. I say he, I shouldn't do that. Jesse was intentionally gender neutral, he or she. We didn't want to try and bring in any bias there. And then finally, we have 2 related to credits that could be taken on a tax return. So in addition to the 6 scenarios, we also did randomized delivery where each of the situations was delivered in random order. And we also did a split where half of the MTurk sample was told they received tax documents. The other half were told that they did not receive tax documents. So control variables, I'm going to list them up there. Very common in literature building up to this. Tried to get as many pieces pulling from that past ethical influence, fairness, social norms. Tried to pull in as many pieces as possible to help control for that. So as far as that dependent variable personality, so if you're seeing there's a lot of questions that would go into this survey, I used a scaled down version of a personality profile test. It was a 20-question measure. There were 4 questions for each of the 5 personality traits, where respondents were asked to respond on a 5-point Likert scale, how they would agree to certain statements such as, I'm the life of the party, and so forth. So as we get into the actual data, very pleased in our gathering of the MTurk, all of the 20 questions loaded properly on their factors. The lowest loading was 0.688, and our Cronbach alpha for all of the scores are presented up there, the lowest being conscientiousness of 0.793, as they were all above a 0.7 cutoff, which we were kind of watching. Very happy with loading and the results that came out of the principal component analysis of that. As far as the sample, so my original goal was to get 300 responses. Part of that was to have enough for this study, but also some additional questions were gathered that would work for future studies that I haven't presented here. So the goal was to get to 300. I watched MTurk as it was coming in. I didn't do a lot of detailed review, but some of the responses that came in, I could tell they weren't really going to work, so I ended up going with 388. No real reason, it just kind of came out to be that number. But as far as what we ended up analyzing, we analyzed 306 responses. Okay, now the data trimming that went on there, there's 15 people that I pulled out because they missed one of the 3 check questions that were embedded in the study. Study on average took just over 15 minutes for each respondent to complete. Although they missed some of those check questions, some of the responses were totally logical, and it appeared just out of carelessness they missed the check question, but to be fair, those were stripped. 5 of the responses were IP addresses outside the United States. Not a guarantee that they weren't US taxpayers, but to be fair, we stripped those as well. And then a couple other minor things pulled out. Now the big one I just want to talk on in case the question comes up later, I pulled 50 responses because they did not answer all the questions. Now, in analysis, we did mean substitution of those 50, and the results came out the same. But because our sample had adequate power using the 306, I did not see a need to keep the 388 because the responses were the same. But the reasons they missed were because of those questions there. All right. As far as the sample, so this is our sample and compared to the most recent census. The MTurk sample was slightly younger, slightly more educated, slightly less income, and a little bit more male heavy. But in comparison to past literature looking at tax compliance, it was definitely in line. So again, we're excited the results of the MTurk sample. MTurk allowed us to get the data a little bit cheaper than we could have with some other sources. Seemed very close to the national average. So if you remember back to the box, we had 6 scenarios. Now, I've trimmed out all the control variables here because we're just looking at, when I say trim, I've removed them from the slide. Nothing was removed from the regression. They've been removed from the slide. And what we find is extraversion showed a significant relationship both in the side income and the energy credits, as well as the total combined tax score, tax gap. Now, the measure of this dependent variable, what we did is we took, or what I did, is I took the individuals' responses and they were converted to an actual filed tax return. A larger number is an absolute value statement as to how far they were in noncompliance. So again, the bigger the number, the more noncompliant a taxpayer would be. So what we're seeing here with this positive direction is that extroverts are more likely not to comply, which was, if you went back to the hypothesis slide, what we had anticipated. Now, I'm also highlighting conscientiousness up there. So conscientiousness is in green. This is opposite direction that was hypothesized. In addition, you'll see going across, there's no other stars indicating significance. The only other one we have is business expenses, which had a very low R-squared, so opposite direction was not deemed supported. So taking these 6, I will say my original reaction when I did this, I was kind of bummed. I was hoping for a little more based on building on past literature, but the game was not over. So what we then did is we did factor analysis on the 6 situations, and we looked for loading to see where the 6 different situations of taxpayers fell. And what ended up happening is the 2 income loaded properly on one factor, and the 2 related to expenses and 2 related to credits loaded on a second factor. The split in factors both loaded at a higher level than if we kept one single tax noncompliance factor, so we split these. Now if you look, again, we have extraversion being significant, conscientiousness, again, still not in the direction that was hypothesized. Going forward, the next step we did is we bootstrapped. So I haven't put it up here. A lot of our taxpayers did not comply. Okay, we had a very high rate of noncompliance. Now, what I did is I compared, so right now the current rate of noncompliance in the United States is just short of 20%. 20% is lost tax dollars. I compared the sample of the 306, which if everybody had complied, it would have brought in around $2.1 million in pretend revenue. We were right in that range of 80%. So the noncompliance based on actual tax dollars was very close. But we bootstrapped because that high rate of noncompliance gave us some irregular. We did not get a normal distribution of error terms, so we were trying to deal with that. So we bootstrapped, and with 150 repetitions, we have extraversion being significant, conscientiousness still not in the right direction. But what we find here is we got a significant model improvement over a base model. So I ran a base model without any personality traits with those control variables that I had listed. And what we find is with the bootstrapped model, we did get a significant model improvement by including the personality traits. So as far as non-significant findings, because of the 5 hypotheses, several of them were not supported. So as far as neuroticism, past research has shown conflicting results. So Turner 2014, that study on white-collar crime, had shown a little bit of a positive relationship there. If we go back a little bit older, Alajeto back in 2003 showed a negative relationship. So the fact that we didn't have findings, although non-significant, maybe is an answer to why those past studies had opposite results. Agreeableness. So if we went back to that slide, you'll notice we had a negative relationship, okay? So it was not significant. Past research, however, showed a similar direction. And if I went through my model and I started stripping out some of those control variables, I could get a significant result. Now, the goal was not to prove significance, but if you went back and read some of those previous studies, what you'd find is they lacked a lot of control variables. They really just pulled in personality and a dependent variable, and there was significance. So part of our non-significance, we feel there's a contribution here, that some of those earlier studies showing that agreeableness personality trait had an influence may not actually be the case if we control for all variables that would be appropriate. In addition, our mean score of respondents was a little on the higher side. Now, when I say higher side, that's purely looking at a 5-point Likert scale. Past studies that looked at personality tend to also show a higher tendency of that agreeableness trait. As to conscientiousness, so we had limited significance here. That was only related to side income, and it was in the incorrect direction. Past studies have again shown conflicting results on this. So Turner 2014 showed lower scores being more likely to be non-compliant with white-collar crime. Blickel, and a year slipping my mind, it's been the 2000s, actually showed a positive relationship. So this is unique. So this was not supported, but what we're saying here is in that side design income, more conscientious individuals we didn't have significance here, but there may be something going on there where more conscientious individuals are actually more likely to cheat on their taxes. Finally, openness to experience. This is in line with all past research. Openness to experience has not shown significant results. Again, the mean score was a little bit on the higher side, but that also falls in line with past research. So here's just a quick table of what came through. So of our 5 hypotheses, we're deeming that extraversion is supported. The other 4 are not. As far as the significant findings, what does this mean? So extraversion shows a relationship with noncompliance. That's what the study had supported. And just to pull in my professional experience, that's believable to me. Sitting with clients that are a little more outgoing, talkative, things like that, it was a believable result that didn't influence anything, but to me it made sense. Tax compliance differs from white-collar crime. So if you remember those three pieces this study was going after, one as to personality, two, should it be pulled away from white-collar crime? The answer on that second one is yes. Extraversion showed significance. That was not a factor with white-collar crime. In addition, agreeableness that was significant with white-collar crime was not here when we brought in those additional control variables. And then conscientiousness is actually in that opposite direction, not significant, but perhaps warranting some future research. And finally, tax compliance is a complex process. The 6 different situations, if you looked at the R-squareds across them, were very different. Side design income, that I called it, that is a popular measure. How much income would you not report? It's a very popular measure in research, but it shows that maybe that generalizing that answer across other tax compliance situations is not proper. So as far as additional findings, so going beyond personality, several control variables, some interesting things emerged. So if you remember, I said I split based upon tax documents. So what we find here is that taxpayers that receive tax documents related to their income were more compliant. It's a very logical expected relationship. But we also found is taxpayers that received tax documents as to the income that they received were actually more non-compliant in their expenses. So one interesting post hoc finding. In addition, knowledge. The more knowledge a taxpayer has specific to tax law, the more compliant they are. Little contribution here to research. It's a gray area. Knowledge is a tough one to measure. A lot of studies look at college education and they deem that a proxy for knowledge as to tax law, which probably isn't fair. This study was very specific as to tax law knowledge. And then finally, frequency. So we also controlled for how many times the respondents had seen these issues in the past 5 years. And what we found is the more often a taxpayer saw that issue, the more likely they were not to comply. Okay. Limitations of this study. It was an online survey. There was also lack of economic risk and reward. So every respondent was paid $4 to take the survey, whether they answered compliant or non-compliant. So that is one limitation. It was also based on hypothetical tax filing scenarios. So we did our best to control for this by asking if they'd ever seen the issues. We don't know how they would actually file a tax return if they received it, but with the extent of control variables, results were still very interesting and kind of led belief that it appears that this could be a real issue. And then also limited taxpayer exposure to items. So the most popular item was income, which over the last 5 years, the average of the 306 was that it had been seen 1.6 times. If we went down to some of the credits, those had only been seen around 0.25, 0.3 times, so quite a bit less. As far as future research, so I'm a proponent of continued future research with personality, especially as to the trait of extraversion, looking deeper at conscientiousness to see if there maybe is a significant relationship there that just wasn't discovered in this study. Also bringing in other personality frameworks, so AB personality, MBTI, something like that, just to see if other personality frameworks, perhaps the dark triad, some stuff like that. In addition, potential negative consequences of tax form issuing. So tax forms within the professional world are known to increase compliance, but it raises question if perhaps on that expense side, it actually causes the opposite to occur. Perhaps re-replication with more of a risk-reward economic experiment. And also there's a whole theory as to personality sometimes gives limited results when looked at standalone as to an interactionalist theory, which how does personality interact with other variables to provide significant findings. All right, so that brings us to the end of essay 1, and we're going to move on to essay number 2. So the goal of essay number 2, you can read the title slide, is but really to look at national culture and how it interacts or moderates individual taxpayer compliance variables. So in the paper, there's 3 words that jump out at me from my professional experience, which, how do we profile, interact, and assess compliant versus non-compliant? So whether that's in a tax professional setting, whether that's in a government auditing setting, whether that's in setting up tax law, but how do we foster that? So that was really one of the big pieces behind this second essay. So as far as past literature on this, in a tax compliance theory world, so some of the earlier theories were really that if the penalty is significant enough, you're not going to cheat. If the penalty is not enough or the reward of cheating is greater, you may cheat. So a lot of those theories fell under general deterrence. And then we brought in the economic factor. Not a lot of taxpayers go to jail, but there's that risk reward of penalty and that type of stuff, which brings in more economic factors. And a third piece, which really receives a lot of attention today, relates to fiscal psychology. So psychology, personality, social norms, those types of things. How do those all come together to either foster compliance or the opposite? Now, the lower part of this slide is an introduction or a quick build on the literature related to tax compliance research in a cross-culture setting. So the first one we have there is Riahi Bauku. They look at tax compliance and tax morale. Again, so the morale is understanding tax law. The higher your morale related to tax, the more likely you are going to be to comply. Alm Torgler did the same thing. Now Richardson, 2006. So they were the first to really bring in culture and look specifically as to how culture relates to tax evasion. And then their second study, or his second study, was in 2008, really brought in national culture and looked at how the direct main influence between culture and tax compliance related. Sukumis et al. Did the same thing. Now, all of these studies, if we looked at them, they were done in aggregated form. So what that means is we lose any variety of individuals. We just make an assumption that individuals in the USA are going to be more compliant than individuals in India. But we lose the individual characteristics, which as I got into this literature, it was a huge limitation to me. It said, the ability exists with today's statistical methods to capture that. So why are we not? And that's one of the pieces where this study contributes. Now, I've listed down at the bottom Baum-Aldred, 2011. And this study did exactly that. It looked at culture, it looked at multi-level or cross-level, and kept the very important individual level characteristics. But what this study did, very good study, it looked at firms. It didn't look at individuals. In addition, this looked at a different culture framework that I'm going to use in this study. So to kind of segue into that, the culture framework that I'm going to use is Hofstede. Now, this is a more dated framework. Current research up to today from other authors still continues to support the use of this as a framework. But specifically, we're looking at these four pieces. So we're looking at masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, power distance, and individualism. All right? These are the same pieces that were looked at in that Richardson study and the Sukumis study. So again, trying to build and bring that literature forward. Not going to take the time to go through all of them. If we need to reference back to it for questions, we can. But again, a lower score. So as we talk about masculinity, okay, this would be, for example, a culture such as Sweden. Balance between family and work. Fathers and mothers deal with facts and feelings. Both genders are modest and caring. So as we move to the other side, a higher score, so Japan, for example, United States is more on the higher side, but work prevails over family, fathers deal with facts, mothers with feelings, men should be and women may be more assertive and ambitious. So if those words are words you've heard before, or if you're into culture research, it should be logical. If you haven't, the definitions as to what would be a lower score, higher score, for the most part, are pretty logical. So here's the model. We're keeping the very important individual level characteristics, and then we're bringing in the national level characteristics. So these are the different country culture variables, looking at the relationship on tax compliance intentions while controlling for several variables. So we've picked three variables. So going back to those literature reviews by Richardson and Sawyer and a couple other pieces like that, these are variables in tax compliance research that have traditionally shown certain relationships. And we'll talk about those more when I bring in the results. Seeking to answer the question, does national culture moderate the influence between individual determinants and taxpayer compliance intentions? Okay, so again, this is me sitting at my desk. Now, granted, I don't have a lot of cross-culture tax research or tax professional experience, but these are very easy variables as far as profiling purposes. Okay. This study had 12 hypotheses. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I do want to highlight the first two. So what I've listed here is in the level 1 direction is research shows that older individuals in tax law are traditionally more compliant, more ethical, that type of stuff. So the hypothesis building on past literature is arguing that in higher scoring masculinity cultures, the older being more compliant is weakened. Okay? And the second one, just to kind of get in the flow, if we want to call it that, again, females in ethics, tax compliance, other related literature, they are more compliant. The hypothesis building on past literature is arguing that as we move into higher scoring masculinity cultures, that relationship of females being more compliant is weakened. All right, so as far as the methods on this second study was done with secondary data. We accessed the World Values Survey, Wave 6, which just finished in 2014, to get those individual level responses. So in this study, we were able to analyze 40 countries, just short of 60,000 individuals. Now, the full Wave 6 of this study had over 90,000 individual responses from around 60 countries. The variables that we were looking for weren't answered in all of those countries or by all those individuals. For that reason, they were trimmed. Okay. The country level data, so the Hofstede study from 1980, we're using 4 of the culture dimensions. Past literature related to tax compliance has looked, there's actually another 2 culture variables, indulgent versus restraint and long-term versus short-term orientation. There's been no significant findings there, so they were excluded. These 4 dimensions explain a majority of culture across countries, and that's why we've kept those. And then we've gone and we've used hierarchical linear modeling. So what this does, if you remember the weakness before of aggregated, where they use the 37 and the 50, what we're allowed to do is look and keep the individual characteristics of all of those respondents. But we're also able to use multi-level of analysis to both see the individual relationship as well as the country relationship and how those interact. And as far as how we're going to proceed, so the next slide we're going to get into the results. I built on the best practice recommendations of Agunis, Godfredson, and Culpepper 2013. So this was a paper very specific to cross-level hierarchical linear modeling, but specifically as to moderation, as to interaction, is how level 2 relates to level 1. I have one more slide, actually. The dependent variable was a single item measure. Okay? It was secondary data, that's all we had. Respondents were asked, cheating on taxes, if you have a chance, can be justified, never, always, something in between. What we find in this, so to help give some validity to this single item measure, that first essay where we did the MTurk survey, this question was also included. The results of that first study actually hold true if we use this as the dependent variable instead of total tax noncompliance. So adding some validity, it was secondary data, it is what it is. All right, so as far as the results, so this is our null model. So if you're not familiar with HLM, which is that hierarchical linear modeling, what we first do is we look at country and we look at our dependent variable and we see the relationship, that is there a difference? So what we measure is what's this intra-class correlation coefficient. So research shows that if this number gets above 5%, it's saying that there are differences because of country that are worth exploring. So as you see, we're just short of 10% here, showing that this essay is worth moving forward, that there is need to continue going deeper. So the next step, building on the null, is we look at what would be called a random intercept and fixed slope. Okay, so I'm going to use my hands to try and paint the picture here. So as we move between cultures, let's say that this is a very compliant and a very non-compliant. Okay, so what we're saying is we move between countries, we change. We move up that scale. But again, now we talked about males and or females and older people. So what we're saying is, okay, we have this compliance happening over here. What we're saying in this step 2 is that that slope has to be the same. That although there are differences, that as we move, that relationship with age and gender stays the same. So what we then do is we move to step 3. Now as we step through this, and I'll mention in a second, there is a statistical approach to make sure we're seeing a significant change that's worth continuing to climb through these steps. Now fortunately, we have that. But what step 3 does is not only are we allowed to change as to here, but the rate of compliance as we move from male to, or female to male, is allowed to change, right? So we can go, here's in one country, here's another country, here's another country. So finally, we get to move to step 4. So what step 4 does is it seeks to explain that change in the slope of that line that's attributable to the relationship between how culture influences those individual variables. So as we go through this, we do a likelihood ratio test. We found significant at the 0.001 level as we step through this that these models were significant improvement on past. So this is main effect here. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Power distance was significant, individualism, uncertainty avoidance, and the control variables at the top you can see starred as well. That was not the focus of this study. The focus of this study was how does national culture moderate those individual demographic compliance factors. And what we find, we have age and masculinity showing a significant relationship. Now you're going to see very small coefficients here. Everything in HLM has been group-centered. So although small coefficients, that isn't saying that there is no meaningful relationship. It's purely the way the data came through. Second, we have a significant relationship between gender and masculinity. We also see a significant relationship for self-employment and uncertainty avoidance. And then gender and individualism also shows a significant relationship. I'm going to spend more time. I'm going to show you graphs in a second that I think paint this picture a little clearer than this table does. Now, there is one more asterisk up there. We have self-employment and masculinity. Although statistically it was significant, interpreting the results, there was no meaningful impact. So for that red one, we're going to deem that not to be supported, with the other 4 being supported. So as far as the graphs, I think this really paints the picture. So older individuals being more compliant, the argument is that that would be weakened. All right, so what we see here, this is a higher scoring masculinity culture. This is lower scoring. So as we move into that culture, again, you'll see that we have a more compliant, so this is our y-axis here, this is more compliant older individuals. That rate of compliance is weakened. So as we shift into higher scoring masculinity cultures, the older individual is less compliant. So that finds that H1A was supported as that table before had showed. So I'm going to continue through this on the next 3 hypotheses that we found were supported. So masculinity and age. Female being more compliant, the interaction effect that the hypothesis brought us to would be, or the literature brought to the hypothesis, was it'd be weakened. So our top line is men being more non-compliant. Here's females. As we move into that higher scoring masculinity culture, we find in fact that their relationship is weakened. Now third, making H1B supported. Third one, we look at uncertainty, avoidance, and employment type. Now, this is more for future research. We find a very unique main effect relationship, which is here. To make the interpretation of this graph slightly easier, I'm going to shift over, and we're only going to look at the positive standard deviation side. So again, tax noncompliance is on our y-axis. We have our 0 standard deviation and 1 standard deviation of uncertainty and avoidance. So we have self-employed at the top, and this is more of a U.S. term, but as we're all here in the U.S., I used it. Form W-2, so this is someone that would be working for someone else. So the relationship was that self-employed are less compliant, and that relationship would be strengthened. So as we look here, notice the gap increasing as we move through to a stronger uncertainty avoidance culture, making H2C also supported. Finally, our 4th supported hypothesis looked at the relationship between individualism and gender. So females being more compliant, that it would be strengthened. So again, you'll notice as we move into a higher scoring individualism culture, the gap up here is increasing. So what we're seeing is that more compliant is actually being strengthened. So H4B also supported. Now of the 12 hypotheses, 8 of them were deemed not supported, either because of lack of actual real-world implication or just statistically no significance was found. So uncertainty avoidance. So this is the culture dimension that looks at the extent that the unknown causes uncertainty. There was no interaction with age or gender. Just did not exist. Now as far as power distance, so this is acceptance within a culture that people are unequal. So no moderation was observed, but what we did see, and I had shown this in purple, is that in all of the models, power distance was statistically significant in main effect forms. So the finding that we kind of came to is that power distance is just such a strong main effect that there is no interaction, that as we move in cultures that are higher scoring, higher levels of noncompliance. Now, this is the first study to look at moderation in a tax compliance setting cross-culturally. If we borrow from other research, Hoff looked at job satisfaction, and they found the same relationship. There was no significant moderation found related to this culture dimension. Individualism focuses on individual versus society. No interaction with age or income source was seen, so we only saw it with gender. And again, similar to that power distance dimension, is significant in main effect influence. So as far as summary of the results, these are the 12 hypotheses. The 4 that I've put in purple there are what were supported. Now, significant findings. So what this means. National culture is a statistically significant moderator. Answering the question that yes, it is. If we went back to that second slide of my presentation, it is. Specifically as to masculinity with age and gender, uncertainty avoidance with income source, as well as individualism with gender. HLM usage is very appropriate and fruitful. We see those individual level characteristics through that cross-level moderation being very relevant. Even as we stepped into step 2, step 3, those individual characteristics showed significance and are worthy of attention. And if you're curious, if you're looking to outsource accounting work or put a business in a place that's very compliant, we should all go get females that live in Sweden that are young. Okay? But there is some relationship there. So cross-culture research, cross-country research is still newer in tax noncompliance. And as we seek to put together a framework of compliance and noncompliance, there is a small piece added by looking at culture, as Richardson and Sukumis had shown, but also adding onto that as to the moderation that's observed. Now, limitations. This is a dated framework. Now, I believe, based on what we're seeing in other studies, that Hofstede framework is still alive and well, but it is a dated framework as to those culture dimensions. We have that single item dependent measure as to can you justify cheating on taxes if the opportunity arose. What we did in the first study by bringing in that question seemed to help limit concern on that, but still a limitation. And there's a word in a lot of research, but if we put it in a tax research, a value action gap. Just because you answer one thing doesn't mean you're going to act another way. This was built on secondary data. Our study kept 40 countries. The World Value Survey does their best to maintain honesty of answers and record keeping, but it's going across 40 countries over a 4-year period. There is possibility of some issues with secondary data, but it's what we had. And there was narrow scope of variables. Part of that is because the goal of this study was to seek variables that could be used for profiling. Some was because it was secondary data, but that is acknowledged as a limitation. Future research, continued culture research. Hofstede framework, perhaps bring in the GLOBE study as the Bay-Maldred study had done. Maybe a better understanding of the main effect influence. There's only been a couple papers that have looked at the direct effect or main effect. This paper this essay lends support as to moderation, but there still is some need for added main effect relationships. Additional variables, bringing in that tax morale, enforcement initiatives in different countries, social norms, those types of things. And also different tax types. We only looked at individual taxpayer compliance here. There's business entity tax, sales tax, value-added tax. Different countries have different taxes. Perhaps a fruitful way to move this research forward. And of course, continued usage of HLM techniques. It's based on reading, it's not an overly popular methodology right now in accounting research, tax research. This study lends support for that. In other disciplines such as marketing management, very, very, very popular. So, in summary, bringing these two papers together, what we find is that the big 5 traits are a predictor of tax compliance. Those extroverts may be more non-compliant, and there is a contribution there. We've identified the uniqueness of tax filing scenarios. 6 different scenarios were used. We did see loading of 2 specific factors, but the 6 different situations show that they're very unique And we maybe need to be careful when we do research to make sure we're including as much of the spectrum of tax compliance as possible. We looked at the moderating effect of culture and did find that in 4 of the 12 hypotheses there were significant relationships. And it really provides information that can be used to assist with greater understanding of what the antecedents to taxpayer compliance are. It could be used for taxpayer screening, perhaps audits, perhaps a simple question as to what's your home country, your country of origin. That might provide some interesting help as we look to profile, assess, and interact with compliant taxpayers. Also, decisions related to cross-cultural businesses, outsourcing, moving work, opening up new offices, that type of stuff. And then a plethora of future possibilities as to research related to tax documents, knowledge, personality, culture. I think there's a lot to move this forward. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I think if I understand correctly, we now open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. This was interesting. And my first question, after we provide you guidance about using MTurk, looking at the literature, there does seem to be still some skepticism about using MTurk. Can you tell us a little bit why you decided to go with it and how you would convince someone that you have good data?
Yeah, it's a good question. MTurk is becoming popular in all disciplines. I wrote some down because this is a question that was also asked during my other one. These are all in the paper, but there's some citations. Kassler 2013, results are similar to more traditional methods. Burmaster et al., comparable psychometric standards, but actually more diverse and more representative. Paolocci 2014 highlights the reasonable cost. The MTurk for me was selected, one, because it was something I'd never done before. Part of going through the DBA program, it seemed something to try. It opened up a new door for me. I was able to get the data very quickly. It was slightly cheaper than what I would have been able to do through Qualtrics. Now, those are all the things that I think are the value add, if you will. I mean, the big thing, if we went back to the demographic slide, the population is in line with other studies that have, or my sample is in line in comparison to national population, to other Qualtrics studies or student studies or whatever the study was. It's not an exact mirror of the national population, but it's very close. We pulled in our MTurk 306 respondents. We had 42 states represented, District of Columbia with 26 different occupations. So we pulled in a very broad sample. So I'm confident in the results that if we use Qualtrics or hand-collected surveys, that I think we would see similar findings to what came through here.
And also you mentioned that you had to throw out 82, and when I was reading the dissertation, I didn't really, it didn't dawn on me that's almost like a quarter of what you had collected. Did you look at those at all? You did mention that you looked at the 50, but does that change anything?
Yeah, well, so the 15 I pulled out because they mischecked questions. Now, I did look at them, and some of them I was like, I want to keep this, but keeping high ethical standard, obviously that's not what did. The responses, so it was around 15 and a half minutes was the average completion time. The quickest person that was kept in the survey, I think, was like 12 and a half minutes, and the longest was, I think, around 40 minutes or something like that. There were a lot of questions, okay? So a lot of them were quicker questions. So the 20-item scale for personality, how many times have you seen each of these 6 situations in the last 5 years? But there were a lot. And to be in compliance with IRB, I wasn't able, or I chose not to. None of the questions were restricted. They didn't have to answer any of the questions. They could have just went next, 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 next. So over a 15-and-a-half-minute survey, the fact that people missed one question, I mean, one little mouse glitch could cause that. So I really don't think it was an issue that they weren't paying attention or that it was low-quality MTurk or anything like that. I think it was just purely, there were a lot of questions, and I spaced it the best I could over several screens, but I think that that's a realistic possibility. we did mean substitution of almost all the variables. Now, my immediate memory, so this was the first paper that I did statistical work on, was back in January, February, so it's not completely fresh. I redid all the results before coming in here today. I know I did mean substitution on the 50 removed responses. My memory is I actually did mean substitution on all of them, with except for a couple people finished, four or five people finished the survey in like 3 minutes, which is obvious they weren't paying attention. But the others that it appeared that they tried their best, which I don't even know who they are, the answers came out the same. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. And actually, I just have one more for essay number 1. So, you know, the field talks a lot about accepting insignificant results, and, you know, if you look at what you found, you did the best you could, and still, you know, out of the many hypotheses, only a few got supported. You know, as you move on to the next step, what kinds of difficulties are you anticipating in terms of selling the results, you know, the way it is, or do you have some other ideas in terms of how to get this published?
It's a great question. Yeah, so one of the things, and I don't know if I wrote this down in my, I have a slide on it if it helps, but Tonendal 2011 uses the program of R, which is open source, and they do a relative weight importance of your coefficients based on eigenvalues. Okay. And I have a slide if you want to see it, but what we find is that personality trait of extraversion, which is the only one that was supported, you know, the biggest predictors of tax compliance as controlled in the study were the more you want to reduce your taxes, the more likely you are to cheat. Logical. The more unfair you think the tax system is, the more likely you are to cheat. But extraversion was actually in the top 4 as to relative importance. So there's of the predictive capability of the income, which was around 26%, was the adjusted R-squared, right around there. We could pull it if we need to. Extraversion was 4% contributing to that. It was in the top 4 as predictive variables that I included in the study. So it will be an interesting one. I mean, I think a lot of perhaps future research building on that may build off some of the post hoc findings, but I do hope there's an outlet for extraversion. Some of the fraud literature does show that there is some findings related to extroverts that being more likely to commit fraud, those types of things.
And we do have some accounting experts. Hopefully they can comment on this. But, you know, that also tells me that maybe treating compliance as one thing in terms of looking at income versus expenses, maybe it's not the same thing. Maybe there's some kind of view that, you know, maybe one may not be as susceptible to personality as the other. I don't know what the literature says, but so for the second essay, I just have one kind of more curious comment or question. In terms of looking at these 4 countries for Hofstede, were you able to get the actual scores for all 40 countries? So or did you do some substitutions?
Yes, yeah, so we did some substitution. Around 3 countries we borrowed from neighboring countries or similar cultures to get to the 40. I almost wish Dr. Werner was here because I know what his question would be. But you know, power, when we look at HLM research, is a difficult thing to actually measure. It's a harder thing. So, you know, some of the earlier studies on that said, you know, if you have 30 countries with 30 individuals, that would be acceptable. So the goal was to get as high as possible, and, you know, through the help of my committee, we were able to find, you know, cultures that were similar either by neighboring, you know, borders or stuff that we did borrow from. But, you know, going back to the power question, even if we went down to the 36 or 37 that we had, you know, first Hofstede response on, we still would have had enough power to be over that, you know, the 0.8 if we.
Oh, so you substituted only 3 then?
It was 3 or 4.
Okay. No, that's all right. I mean, we are just working on something where we substituted many more, and
no, my memory is 4. I could be wrong, but it wasn't that many.
That's good.
Because I remember back to my proposal, my original proposal back in December. There were 33 countries we were going to look at, and in pulling data from that, as we got into it, in my quick analysis to get ready for the proposal, I think I had missed 2 or 3 that we actually had Hofstede scores for, and then the rest were added. So it was right in that 4 or 5 range.
And what was the logic again to use Hofstede as opposed to Globe? I just can't quite remember.
Yeah, so for me it was building on literature that Richardson 2006, 2008, and Sukumis they had used Hofstede as a framework. So it was to keep going on that to build on their shoulders, if you will, and bring in that moderation versus going a different route with Globe, which it would have been kind of starting over to Chomain effect as it relates to individuals.
Okay, thank you.
Brian, so for essay 1, I was just wondering, how would you explain the counterintuitive finding in terms of conscientiousness?
It's a very good question. As everybody's question today, it's very good. So tax compliance is an interesting one. So white collar crime, and why I kind of thought some of the findings would be different. White collar crime typically, that's not a fair word. Let's just go with tax compliance. I do it by myself. I'm in my house doing TurboTax. Maybe I use a tax preparer, but it's a very individual decision. I don't need to convince you to go along with me to do it. If we were married, I probably would, but even not a guarantee. There's quite a bit of issues with spouses where the husband is very non-compliant, and then the female finds out about it 10 years later when notices start arriving in the mail. So the research didn't build me to this, but logically, a more conscientious person, better record keeping, I could see that it's, if you're going to cheat a system, the more organized you are or intentionally excluding something from your organization, it becomes the potential to be non-compliant and to have paperwork that supports your non-compliance could be elevated. In my professional view, practitioner view, I could see that relationship being seen. Does that answer your question as to conscientiousness?
So what you're saying is that if the person gets caught, they have the paperwork to sort of dig themselves out?
Yes. Okay. Yes. And it's more calculated. If I'm conscientiousness, I understand the rules, I read. It's a more deliberate process. I don't have any support for this. It would be a future study to look specifically at that personality trait and maybe how decisions are made, how records are kept, those types of things. But from my professional experience, I could see that relationship being believable.
Okay, yeah, because if you're able to sell this would be a super interesting finding to sell.
Okay.
So. Then my second question it's for essay 2.
Yes.
It's a pretty basic question. So on your citations, like one of the slides, you had numbers. I was just curious, what were those numbers for?
Oh, the 37 and the 50?
35, 45.
Yeah, so that was the sample size that those studies used. So
the countries or the?
Countries.
Countries, okay.
Yes, countries. But again, so Richardson 2008 did pull in some individual level characteristics, but they just averaged them. And then, well, okay, this country's got this income and this country's got this. And we lose, for our study of 40 countries, you'd lose, 59,850 very important predictors because we averaged them. Now, the goal of their study was focusing on national culture, not the individual level, and that's kind of where this study contributes.
Yeah, that's it.
Hi, Brian. I would just say that you did a great job to presenting a lot of information within the allowed period of time. So I only have 2 comments. And the first one is following Praveen's question about Hofstede. The national culture score was published or made available in the 1980s. And then right now you are using the worldwide value data in 2014. And then, of course, you already show us that in the literature, the national culture dimension value is consistent or reliable. I would say that perhaps it will be of value to check that maybe worldwide value survey back in wave, 3, or actually wave 1 that closer to the original time that when the national culture dimension score was available, and then that can add additional external validity to your study.
Yeah, that's a very...
Right. And then the other one is talking about the bootstrapping, and then you use the like 150, and given today's computer power, maybe we can consider to increase that the bootstrapping sample size to be like 1,000 or something, and hopefully we have the same result that again add additional validity to your research outcome. And that's only my 2 comments.
Thank you very much. That's a very good idea.
Okay, so now we can open it to questions from the audience. I don't know. Yeah.
Hi, Brian. I think you also did a great job of presenting a lot of detail there. I'm interested in the measure you chose for personality. So you talked about the fact that you might, in the future, try Myers-Briggs or try something else to see if measuring personality differently would yield a different result. So how did you decide on the one that you did use?
I need to get better at memorizing years. I could look, if you want the year, I'll get it to you. But Taggart Parkinson did a literature review on accounting research and specifically personality studies. So in your mind, you're going, well, wait, I thought you said this was one of the first. Related to tax compliance, it is. So accounting research has seen personality typically used as to job, career advancement, decisions that are made by partners and bigger firms, those types of things. It hasn't been seen in tax compliance. But what that study showed and indicated, I'm not going to get the exact quote right, that the big 5, the 5-factor model, was really the best in, I should look because I put it in my notes somewhere here. I may not find it as quick as I want. Basically, that is the best study for predictive capability. Those 5 factors were the best. So that was the reason, one of the reasons. In addition, building on the Turner 2014 that had used white-collar crime, that would be a second reason. And included in my questions for this, I had a question for narcissism and stuff like that that isn't in this analysis. It'd be more for future stuff. But it would be interesting, related to extraversion and AB type, because there's overlap between those, what the results would be. So an area for future research. But that's the reason I picked that one.
Okay, so I think when you think about tax compliance and white-collar crime, one of the fields that you're sort of dipping into is fraud research, right? And I think that there is personality research about who commits fraud, who's most likely to be non-compliant in any area.
Right.
So I think that's another thing that you might think about drawing parallels when you're trying to sell your work, when you're trying to take the pieces that worked, look at the pieces that worked when people are trying to, whether it's Myers-Briggs or whatever they're trying to predict who's going to, everyone's interested in that, right?
Right.
Who's going to be honest, who's going to commit fraud. So I think that's an interesting thing.
Okay.
When you think about your many hypotheses and the fact that only really a limited number of them come out, does it tempt you to want to collect more data, or does it tempt you to want to just focus in on the factors that seem to be working and try to figure out why?
Both.
Both.
You
can't answer both.
I can't have both.
Well, right?
Next. Next, I think the path of least resistance might be going with the ones that do have some relationship and going forward with those. Some of the traits in building on literature, and I need to explore some fraud stuff, more as you said, but like agreeableness. To me, that was a trait that I was, it's tough coming through the doctoral program. Some of the stuff, some of the early papers we used results that we didn't have for. It was make a table and learn how stuff, or we used textbook problems where it's very easy to interpret. So Max did a great job counseling me when I got to that point, because I was almost devastated. Like, oh my gosh, I had 5 hypotheses. The literature brought me to this, and I only got 1. What do I do? So I feel there's more where I'd like to get more data because I just feel there's more, but in the path of least resistance, I'd like to kind of take what I have and move that. So again, I'm still saying both, but let's go with keep what I have, keep extraversion, added study as to conscientiousness, and keep moving.
You know, it's an interesting point to Darcy. They had a study where they compared dissertations with actual publications and how people just strip out the non-significant findings. And it is an ethical issue now. You know, do we just look at the history, the income and just send that for paper, you know, or do you present it as it is? So, other questions?
The uniqueness of the 6 different. I mean, those R-squareds were changed, and even some of the known predictors, you know, a lot of research typically looks at income or business expenses or charitable contributions. They're very common. You know, so one of the issues I have is, well, not everybody gets to take contributions. Not everybody gets to take business expenses. So we're using a sample that may never see it, but huge swing between 26% down to 8% of an R-squared between those 2 categories. And, you know, so I think that's another way to move it forward, too.
Well, I think the most dangerous route is to assume that it's out there and your data just didn't find it.
Yep.
I think that's not the right route. I think the right route is to say, okay, I found something and try to figure out why I found it, rather than I didn't find it, I think it's out there, and I'm trying to snatch it from the stars.
Yeah, you know, Max calmed me down because I thought my life was over. Praveen, you did too, but
Yeah. Other questions? Family members? No? Okay.
everyone stay
They
away.
like you, I guess. All
They
right.
like-
Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you,
so
guys. I
much,
appreciate
everyone,
it.
for attending.